One of the things that I find interesting is teaching Underground Railroad history. I usually get the same type of questions. The questions about the intelligence and the ingenuity of enslaved people. People ask, like, how did slaves know where to go? How did they know who to talk to and who not to talk to? How did slaves know how to read the actual constellations to determine the direction that they were traveling in? And it's interesting because the same questions that people have about enslaved people are the exact same questions that they have about the people who built the pyramids. Same questions of intelligence and ingenuity. How did they build these megaliths? How did they align these structures with the actual stars? And the key to understanding this is within language. First and foremost, these were not slaves, right? There's a difference than a person being a slave and a person being an enslaved person. There's a difference between a slave and an enslaved person, right? These weren't slaves who had this genius and this intelligence. These were enslaved people. And their history didn't start in enslavement. We're talking about the ascendants, not descendants, because descend means to travel downward or to fall downward. These were the ascendants of the first world people who fathered and mothered civilization, who brought the world mathematics and science, and even taught the world about who and what God actually is. That is the genetic link to people who were enslaved. So when you have the question about how were they capable, that was in them. That was their nature, to be able to solve these problems of oppression. And when I mentioned about the invisible institution, some of the language that I'm using are also keys for you to explore. Invisible institution. That Black liberation theology that ran consistently amongst freedom seekers, whether that was Harriet Tubman, whether that was my third great grandfather, the Reverend Josiah Henson, whether that was Frederick Douglass, William Still, any of these freedom seekers, that Black liberation theology that ran consistently throughout these freedom seekers was connected to the stories that you learn about in the Bible, but it was viewed from the perspective of oppressed people. So even though you had people on plantations that couldn't read, the stories that were shared with them, they immediately were able to connect with people of this book who were oppressed from Genesis to Revelations, that were living under the enslavement of the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Persians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans. It was easy to connect with those people. And that really is what came as the basis of their ability to endure these conditions in slavery, as well as to have the courage to raise up in armed rebellion and the wisdom to be able to escape. You think about movements such as the Underground Railroad or the Civil Rights Movement. A lot of times you hear a lot of myths, right? I heard a myth recently that there was some woman that taught Harriet Tubman how to recognize a North Star. I'm like, can Black people just have something to ourselves, And you oftentimes have people who feel as if they have to constantly inject themselves into the narrative. The same thing with what I mentioned about the building of the pyramids. It's obvious who built the pyramids. Egypt is in the middle of Africa. Egypt means the land of the burnt faces. The original name of Egypt is Kemet, which means the black land, and it's not talking about soil. But yet, when you look at the iconography and the images and stuff, you see people who don't look like they're from Egypt at all. Or with the archaeological findings and stuff, and even the stone reliefs that show you who the Egyptians actually are. Some people will look at that and they're so committed to their ideology of white supremacy that if they can't say they did it, they're going to say ancient aliens did it. Now, I haven't heard the ancient aliens theory with the Underground Railroad yet, but I'm sure it's coming somewhere in the future with the myths that are shared about what's going on. Right? So a part of this process and this journey of education is also unlearning a lot of the things that we were taught about ourselves and about each other. And this focus on the bicentennial of Harriet Tubman is a good starting point in terms of learning a little bit more about an extraordinary woman who did things that were beyond human capacity. And I speak to the ability to do things beyond human capacity because it also gives you insight into the type of God that enslaved people were connected to. Not that white man's God, but the God that they reached into their inner recesses and connected with, that allowed them to have the wisdom, strength, and beauty to not just endure, not just to display resilience, but to be evidence even today as what is known as anti-fragility. You know, for those of you who are not familiar with anti-fragility, if you were to break a bone, usually that bone heals and becomes stronger than what it originally was. That's who I represent in terms of my people who traveled here to the wilderness of North America and who went through the Great Mayafo or the transatlantic slave trade and worked on those plantations in the South and eventually escaped.